Hello, welcome back to the studio. Well, I've got a canvas all ready to go, but what am I painting? This week, bridges. In fact, I picked this little photograph up off of Pixabay and thought that's smashing because I want to do it with glazes. That's right, I'm going to paint this with a series of glazes rather than doing my traditional sort of Bob Ross style of blocking in sort of nice heavy dark colour. It's an interesting process and one which I think you'll enjoy watching. The first thing I have to do though is get this sketched onto my canvas. Now, if you're good at drawing, then you can obviously just freehand this onto the canvas. But if you sort of struggle with that, you might find something like this quite helpful. This is graphite paper. Don't forget, it's got one side which is graphite and one side which isn't, so you've got to get it on the right way round. And the other thing I've done is to actually enlarge my photograph so it fits the canvas. And I used a simple little program called Post Eraser, but there are lots of print programs you can find online that will help you blow up a photograph so it fits the canvas. And I want to position this so that the main feature here is slightly off center. If I position it slap bang in the middle of the canvas, then it's sort of a bit like a roundabout. And I want to push it just off sort of center, slightly to the right hand side and not quite midway, so I've gone just slightly above. That gives me plenty of room for foreground. Now let's get this traced onto the canvas and get painting. So I've got my little drawing and my graphite paper all set up. I use a couple of bulldog clips to hold it onto my canvas, and I've made sure that everything sits level here at the bottom. It looks a little bit out of line, that's just a camera angle, but as you can see it's all ready to go. I've made sure I've got my graphite paper on the right way around, and I like to use something like a ballpoint pen or a biro, and literally I just want to go around and trace on the outline, and I'm not going to try and do all of these individual bricks or blocks or stones. I'm going to do that bit freehand. Now obviously this is easier with everything laid flat on a tabletop, which is what I suggest you do, and I'm just going to sketch this in so that I've got a pretty good idea of where all the various lines are. And as I say, the reflections, they can be quite loose, and of course I do recommend after a few minutes of tracing you do a quick double check and make sure that you are doing something in case that is on back to front. Ask me how I know. I once did a really complicated zebra, hundreds of stripes. Oh goodness, I can't tell you. And about an hour later, I pulled it off and the blasted graphite paper had gone back to front. There we go. I'll finish this off and then we'll come back and see what we've got to work with. So I finished my tracing. Let's take these bulldog clips off. And there we have it. I don't want this to be too defined or too strong because I'm going to be doing an underpainting using my layout lines as reference. That's probably graphite paper. I'm afraid the bulldog clip leaves a few marks, but don't worry, we'll wash those away. But yes, I'm going to be doing an underpainting with this, but I'm going to be doing an underpainting not in acrylics. I'm going to be underpainting this with oils. Sit tight. I've got an eraser and I can simply rub out a little bit of graphite that was left by the bulldog clip. There we go. Now let's have a look and see what's on my palette. Titanium white and Payne's grey. That's right, I'm going to be simply doing this as a black and white underpainting. I've chosen Payne's grey, personal preference, because I quite like the sort of the blue-grey colour it produces. If you didn't have Payne's grey, you could just put out some black and make a grey with some black and white. It's as simple as that. Personal preference only. But you can actually make Payne's grey if you've got a nice blue and some dark sienna. Mix those up and it will get you a nice blue-grey colour as well. So there's many ways to get to Payne's grey or something similar. I'm going to be using a couple of old brushes to do this, and this is a real scruffy old filbert brush and an old synthetic brush, and as I mentioned I'm going to be doing this as a grey wash, and to thin my paints I'm going to use this. It's a few drops of odourless thinners. So let's get started. Put a few drops and just dampen my brush. It doesn't need to be soaking wet. Just get the brush a little bit on the damp side. That's it, squeeze out all the excess. And just want to catch the edge of that Payne's grey. I want to produce sort of a very watery, thin or thinned paint. Now, not easy to demonstrate with the palette standing upright because it's obviously going to want to run down my palette. But what we're looking for is a thin, watery colour. Something like that. Let's give that a try. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to sort of rough in the position of my little bridge. So there you go. Now just sort of, so just block this in. Now this is, say, it's oil paint. It's well thinned. And the idea here is that this will go on and it will dry very quickly. And as it dries, it sort of becomes sort of like a permanent part of the painting. So I've got my little reference here. And as I say, I'm just literally going to block this in. No particular detail other than to make sure that where things are dark, like under the bridge here, I'm going to go for a darker colour, so a little bit less oil and a little bit more paint. And the idea here is just to build up the entire scene with this thin wash of grey colours. Now, this will take a few minutes to do, and I can do a little bit of time lapse through this section. But you can see what I'm doing here is I'm just literally, as I think I need to add some blocks and some stones, I'm just going to drop them in. Okay, watch how this painting turns into a grey toned background image. So there you have the initial underpainting, as I say, done in oils, and it's still wet. If I take my thinner's brush and just touch it, I can still move some paint around on here, so I can't carry on playing with this. I need to let it sit and dry for a few minutes. So it takes probably around about, well, say the length of time for a cup of tea, maybe half an hour or 40 minutes. When I come back, I can look at this again. If I need to make any alterations or changes, I can. For instance, I'll probably want to darken this area up underneath the bridge a little bit more, but I need to let this, say, dry. Back in a cup of tea. So here's my painting, about half an hour later. As you can see, the thinness has evaporated and it's just left the paint. Now, if I was to scrub that really hard with some thinners or a little bit of turpentine or linseed oil, I could probably lift that off, but I'd have to go at it pretty hard to remove this now. You see, the paint has now started to stain the canvas, so this is creating a lovely underpainting. That's going to be the coloured version, so I need to build up a little bit more detail, but of course I'm going to carry on painting this in shades of grey. Once we've got all that done, then we can glaze this with some colours. So let's carry on building up the underpainting. I've also switched brushes. I've changed to a little flat brush. I think that'd be more useful for painting those little stones and rocks rather than a round brush. And of course, the paint on my palette has dried out as well. So first step, add a little bit of thinners back onto it, and that will just reactivate the paint. We can go back in. We can start creating these lovely little blocks, and as I say, you can use the brush to add some texture to this. It doesn't have to be smooth. We don't really actually want it smooth, do we? We want it looking kind of nice and lumpy and bumpy, They look like blocks of granite to me. There we go. So you can just kind of drop these in. You can create little lines and ridges between the rocks. And of course we're going to be adding a little bit of light to some of this as well. So let's just drop in a few little crevices and cracks in here and there. And this is really just fun to play with, just to kind of move the paint around, see what you can do. And say, if you put a line in the wrong place, it doesn't matter, because it's still sort of semi-wet, so you can sort of try and tidy things up as you wish as you go along. So again, it's just take your time with it, have some fun, see what you can create, and think of this really like sketching almost, because you can sort of create almost any design you want, and then just use thinned oil paint. There you go. So I'm going to create a little bit more of that. This is definitely going to need to be darker. Again, if you use your reference picture, you can see under there it's really deep shadow under there. And again, I think this is probably where a flat brush would do a better job. Now just don't forget, if you're adding more thinners to your painting, then even though the paint on the canvas has dried, if you start adding lots of thinners to this, then you can obviously bring the first layer back alive again. It can start to become liquid again. So I tend to sort of layer this on. I don't tend to work it too hard. I don't scrub at it. I tend to just let the paint flow on nicely. And you can see you can come back in here and really have a lot of fun adding detail to this bridge. The idea is to make sure that all of these layers eventually become dry so that we can glaze this painting with colour without lifting all of this off. I'll carry on adding detail with some more time lapse. So here's my underpainting all completed. I left it overnight actually so that it's completely dry. Now I want to use a series of glazes to start adding some colour. And I'm sorry about all the time lapse, but our neighbour's got a new toy, a pressure washer. He thinks everything needs to be cleaned within an inch of its life. It's a bit like having a hammer. Everything looks like a nail. You just want to give it a tap. Never mind, I think he's found a new toy to play with, something a bit quieter hopefully. So let's have a look at our palette. As you can see, I've added Prussian blue, sap green, red and Indian yellow. Now, the thing to remember is when we're glazing, it tends to suggest that we're using transparent colours. Colours like Prussian blue and Indian yellow. If you were to put those over something that was black, you'd still see a dark shadow through it. They are transparent glazes. Sap green and red, well, they're in a different sort of category. Red, sap green are opaque colours. That means if you put them over something which was black, but it would cover it incompletely. Same with white. It's an opaque colour. If you put it over something that's dark, it should cover it in completely. But we can trick them. We can apply smaller amounts of each and use them very thinly. Now, it tends to create a little bit of a foggy look to things, so we've got to be careful when we use them, but you can turn them into a glaze. Now the other question we have to think about is, how do we turn these into glazes? Do we use thinners like I did with the grey, or should we use oil? I think we're going to be using oil from now on, because I actually don't want these colours to dry on the canvas particularly. I want to be able to blend them and come back and rework them. Unlike the grey colour, which I want to remain fixed. So the next step is to cover our canvas with a tiny amount of oil. I could use Bob Ross Liquid Clear, which dries quite quickly, or I could use linseed oil. If you have one or the other, then that's what I would use. For today's painting, I'm going to use linseed oil for a change. Let's get a thin coat of that on next. I've got a tiny drop of linseed oil in one of my little dishes here. I'm going to use this little 3/4 inch bristle brush to apply it. Now, let's say it's only a small canvas, and the idea here is that we just literally want to give this canvas the smallest coating, enough to sort of enable us to blend and move our colours. And the reason why an oil is used next is because it won't dissolve the grey underpainting. Just think, if we put thinners mixing it in with our paint and then try to work over the top of this, then, well, all the colours would start to dissolve the grey. So you see, this is the reason why I started out with thinners, just to get the initial fixed underpainting done, and then revert to using oils when I want to glaze things over the top. As you see, you can scrub at this pretty good, and it won't lift and it won't move. But if I wanted to take something off of here, before I start using oils, I just pick up something with thinners on it and wash it off. So this is a really fun way of learning to paint. So I finished off giving my canvas a very thin coat of linseed oil. But if I want to know how much is on there, I'll need another light. And mobile phones have torches built into them. If you give the phone a little shake, you get a torch. Now, see that lovely glistening effect? If I run my finger across the canvas, I can feel the oil. But if I go down here, you can see that that glistening effect is a little bit stronger. In fact, down here, it's really oily. You can see it on my fingertips. This is too wet. In fact, if you run your finger across it, you almost leave a trail. If I come across the middle of my canvas here, you see that glossy glistening effect is lessened. That's because there's only a small amount of oil here, but just enough to make it shiny. So check your canvases, and if it feels very, very wet and oily to the touch, very glossy and glistening, you know this is a little bit too much. Just go gently over the surface and pick up the surplus oil. As I say, that grey colour there happens when you really scrub at your canvas, as I have done. My canvas is wet and oily and ready to paint on. I want to carry on using this brush, so I dry clean it on a piece of paper towel just to remove all of the surplus linseed oil. And the first areas I want to paint are the sky and the water. These are two big blocks of colour, this area and this area. And I'm going to use that blue colour first. I'm just going to take a little bit of Prussian blue, just a hair. This brush has still got a little drop of oil in it. So this is a nice transparent colour. So let's have a look at what transparent colours do. You see, it goes over the top of that grey colour there. Again, just out of shot, I've got my reference photograph, so I can quickly glance down. And instantly you see the effect of using glazes. That grey colour, it comes grinning through, and over the light grey where there was no grey underpainting, of course, it gives us a different tone of blue, a different value. So I'm just going to apply a small amount. Now again, don't go scrubbing at this too hard, because you will disturb eventually, you can eventually disturb the underpainting if you go at it too hard. But glazes should be applied at this stage very thinly. I'm just going to add some glaze there as well. Now, if you want to lighten this up a little bit more, you can add some white into it. But be prepared. You have to add this very sparingly. And you see I'm going to take some white into my Prussian blue. And let's have a look and see where we want it to be light blue. It's over there, isn't it? Just under that bank. And let's just bring some of that across. Now, as I say, the problem with adding white into a colour is it starts to lose its transparency. It starts to become semi-opaque or even totally opaque. So you see, when I do that, the glaze wants to lift. So you've got to be kind of sparing where you put these colours if you want to keep this lovely dark shade. Now, you could dry clean that brush or use a second brush and add some Prussian blue with a little bit of Payne's grey and put the dark back in. So you can go backwards and forwards using this tone of grey as a map. In fact, sometimes this style of painting is called grisaille or greying out. And these sorts of paintings are sometimes called tonal maps. Lights and darks, shadows and highlights. I'm going to use it more as a glaze this time round, but certainly if I wanted to turn this into a full colour oil painting, I would just use this as a map. Let's add some colour to this sky. I'm going to start off with just a tiny drop of white in Prussian blue. As we see, it's a lovely bright sky. You can see that lots of my little trees and bushes here are going to end up disappearing, but it's okay. I know where they are. I can still see them. In many respects, when you actually look at oil painting done in this style, it can look like a watercolour because the transparency is so good in this style of painting that it can mimic watercolour. Now, if you want to get fancy here, you can use the oil here just to move colour around and create lovely little streaks in the sky. So you can get very inventive with this style as well. I want to get rid of some of that greyness there, you see, because it's not a very grey sky. It's quite a lovely luminous bluish colour. So add a little touch more white, a little touch more Prussian blue, and make a lovely soft sky. Now, let's start adding some detail to our bridge. Let's have a good look at our reference photograph. I'll bring it up here on the screen so you can see it in high detail. Now, you can see when you look at the surface of the stones that actually this looks like granite, doesn't it? It's really lovely and knobbly and bumpy. And you can see that amongst all of those little knobbles and bobbles, there's lots of green algae, like a lichen type sort of vegetation growing through it. So when we come back and look at our bridge, we can see that we need to sort of add a little bit more texture to this and maybe a little bit of the greenish tone to it. Now, as always, I always say that your reference photograph is there to guide you. It's not there to sort of be followed blindly. If you want to change something in your painting, then go ahead and do it. It is not the be-all and end-all, and you will not get picked on by anybody for doing something slightly different because they're never going to see them hanging on the wall together. So we need to mix up a few little colours here, and I've got a little old round brush for doing this. Now, colours we need a nice sort of sap green colour. So I'm going to use sap green, maybe a touch of Indian yellow. It gives us a nice sort of limey green colour. We can darken it with a touch of Payne's grey. So that gets us a nice sort of limey green colour with a touch of shadow to it. You can even add white to it, but careful, that's opaque. That'll cover everything up. So we want to try and stay in the transparent zone if we can. And maybe we could do with some grey colours as well. So Payne's grey on its own applied thinly, we know makes a nice grey colour. I probably could do with a second one of these. I've got this little other brush here, that'll probably do the job for me. So let's start off by sort of just stippling on a little bit of my green colour here. Again, I'm just going to stipple this onto this canvas. Now remember that this painting has got oil in it, so this colour should stick very easily. I need to just speckle it on here and there. And right now, what I'm doing is I'm sort of experimenting with my colours. I'm trying to see what's going to give me the best effect. But I've never painted this bridge before. I've no idea how it's going to turn out. So sometimes you need to experiment and you need to expect, oh, things don't always go as expected. So you might put this on here and think, well, that's really not what I wanted. So you sort of have to do a bit of trial and error. Let's see, I maybe put a bit too much green on those ones. So these ones I'm going to be a little bit more kind of gentle with. Put just a little bit on that one. Just a few of these over here need a touch as well. Maybe I should stick to the edges more. What do you reckon? I'm sort of thinking where the rainwater might strike or light might get to more easily. See, so you kind of got to experiment a bit with a painting when you're working on them. What you often don't see an artist doing especially when they're making tutorials, is that they might be filming a sequence to show you how they got to something. What they probably don't show you is, because maybe time restrictions and like, is they don't show you the fact that they wipe it all off a couple of times or more, because they do something and think, nah, it doesn't quite work. And you have to be prepared to stop and say, no, that's a fail. I didn't get it right. And I think that there wouldn't be an artist alive today who didn't say that they had gotten something badly wrong to the point where they could only wipe it off and start over. You see, as I'm chatting here, I'm just getting a feel for this. I'm just dotting a little bit of green around. I didn't sit filling in one area. Now, again, this is an important step for you to learn when you're painting, is that if you do something and think, that didn't quite work out, don't get disheartened. Go play somewhere else and add a little bit more, and then have a look back and see, well, is it so bad? Because if we concentrate on just filling in two stones and think that we've made a mistake, we may never get past filling in just two stones, folks. So you do have to sort of just play and play and play a little bit more. Now, I don't think that's looking terrible. I think I need a little bit more of a grey speckle to this. Let's give our little round brush a bit of a dry clean. Quick wipe. Let's get a little bit of Payne's grey. Let's say this is a fairly transparent colour. I might tint it a little bit. This is pretty dry. Just tap my brush on that. Now let's just come back in here and have a little play with this. Yes. Let's say we just have to try a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Notice I instinctively hold my brush like a stick. I don't know. There's something about holding it like a stick and using the side of the brush which appeals to me. I much prefer using a brush like a stick than I do like that sometimes. That tends to be a bit too sort of aggressive. Whereas holding it on its side and using the bristles at the side of the brush tends to give me a slightly different look to my work. I think I might do a little bit of time lapse through this section here so you can see it coming together, fingers crossed. In that last little section, when I started adding some details between the various granite blocks on this bridge, I was using a small round synthetic brush. I draw your attention to something I was intentionally doing. You can see that I've quite clearly defined these blocks. I took my time to go between and make some nice deep shadows here, but notice as I go to the other side here how little defined definition I put into this area. Things that are closer to you want to be more defined, more definite and more intricately painted, and as things go further away from you, you want them to become less detailed, less intricate. This helps give the idea of perspective, things going away from you being less detailed, less intense, less bright maybe. So that's the reason why I didn't put a great deal of effort into doing any of the detailing on these stones. Now I've done that section, I get a chance to look back and see what my water and sky looks like. And if I bring up the reference photograph in the corner, I'll bring it up here for me to look at, you can see my sky probably isn't too bad. It probably could do with being a little dark across the top, but now this looks definitely underwhelmed. And this again is part of the process of glazing. It's for you to go back and look at your reference photograph, look at your painting and to make some decisions. I can see that now my colour, which at first glance looked maybe okay, now clearly looks a little bit under. So I need to go back in, Prussian blue, maybe a touch of Payne's grey, really darken it down. On this part of the bank it's almost, well, I wouldn't say it's black, but it's extremely dark. And again, I can just use a little flat brush here, Payne's grey, and I'll try and get just one little patch, super dark. And I think that's the sort of colour I'm going for. And again, I'm just going to lightly brush this on. Same sort of glazing effect, building up layers of paint. Remember, the oil is there, so the paint flows on nicely. And there's a few little ripples along here, so you can turn your brush on edge. And again, you can introduce the idea that there's a few nice little ripples back in there. Over on the other side, there's a nice deep shadow there of the riverbank. So I think it's over here somewhere, shining this way. I'm looking at some long reflections and long shadows being cast here. I'm also looking at some nice long shadows being cast here and some nice shadows on the water. So I think the light source is to the right. Looking at those long shadows on here, painting a nice look. Get my little fan brush on here, whizzy do those out. There we go. That kind of makes it all look a little bit nice and watery. Get rid of my brush marks. I want to do a little bit more work on here. And incidentally, did you notice there is sort of a highlight on the water here? There's a pale greenish patch. So it might be kind of interesting to try and get that effect in here. But so there's dark water here, pale green patch of light there, and then dark blue beyond. So a tricky little, ticklish little thing to do to a painting, but maybe we should have a go and see what we can achieve. As I say, most of what I'm trying here is a bit of an experiment. I'm just going to go back in with my little round brush here. And again, I'm just going to tap in some of the suggestion of greens. And there's even some brown. Now I'm actually looking at this a little bit more. We're going to probably blur this about a little bit. Just remember, whatever you're putting into this part of the painting, it is on the surface of the water. So it's a tricky composition in respect that you're painting detail, but it's actually flat detail, whereas this is sort of actually knobbly and flat. This is actually just reflections in the surface of water. Kind of difficult concept sometimes when we're painting away. We forget that. We seem to think that's actually got depth, but it has no depth. And the other thing I did was I deliberately left this line, scratch it back in again. See, there's a line of unpainted canvas here, and it's not actually on the painting, but sometimes it's fun to actually leave an unpainted line. It's called a relief line. In other words, it's part of the painting which should be painted, but it gives you a nice clear demarcation between one part of the painting, like this, so the reflection of the underside of the bridge, and the stonework on the side. And if you do this sort of effect, you can actually create a more believable sort of reflection. There we go. And you will find that reflections of a part of a painting that are close to, well, part of a painting that's close to its reflection tend to be very similar, whereas up here to down here can be very different. And the further you get away from the reflection, the more variation of colour and detail you get. Once again, I might just use my little fan brush just to break up that edge. There we go. This fan brush is going to become my best friend today. I stood back and looked at my bridge from the other side of the studio, and I noticed when I compare it to my reference photograph, and this is something you can only see when you take a stand back, is that there is a brownish tone. It's grey, but it's got a brownish look as well, and there's a lot of brown in this painting that I haven't included yet. I'm still looking at something which is a little bit on the grey side, so I need to mix up a nice brown colour. Now, if you saw my previous video, you'll know that you can mix a very nice brown colour. You can use some red and sap green to get a nice mid-brown colour. You can even use some alizarin crimson and get almost a Van Dyke brown. So I've got red and sap green on my palette. This incidentally is my own personal little colour wheel I made. It's a very useful little video. You might want to go and watch that after you finish watching this. So take a drop of sap green and a touch of red and see if we can make a nice brown colour for our bridge. There we go, a nice brown colour. And you can make this brown to the green side, brown to the red side. So you can select the colour you get. I think this bridge has got a lot of greeny bits on it, so maybe a slightly more sort of brown to the green side. And instantly, all I did was dry clean this brush on a piece of paper towel. I didn't wash it. So we can add maybe just a little bit of a brown tone to this painting as well. I'm just going to speckle this over. I'm leaving a lot of the grey peeking through. I'm just literally going to tint up some of these stones with a little bit of this brownish colour. I've enjoyed the process of playing with my bridge, putting the rail on and the reflections under the bridge on the water. This still needs a little bit of work doing to it, and I might just run a brush across that later on, put my fan brush across it. But once again, it's a good idea once you've got a feature locked into your painting and established, not just sit playing with that. It needs context, it needs background and backdrop and foreground to sort of get a sense of balance. And I'm going to have a go at painting these little background trees, look like a little bunch of different fir trees, different shapes and sizes, a few different colours. And this is obviously a snow scene, so there's supposed to be some snow back there as well. I don't know if I'll bother with it. Let's just see. So we're looking for a really dark green colour here. We've already mixed up a nice dark green colour, Payne's Grey, sap green. And I'm going to literally just block in a very, very loose impressionist impression of these trees. I'm not, whoops, you can see that colour looks, it's way too lime, isn't it? So I need to put in a little bit more Payne's grey. Again, if the paint's pretty oily, it's quite transparent and see-through, so I'm literally going to just work these in, hold my brush like a stick, have a quick look. I've got a few of them over here, they're quite small and distant, so I'm going to use a little bit less paint and just let the brush just bump and run. Have a few here as well, and again I might well leave one of those little line I left here, might not actually have these touching the top of those fence rails. You see, so sometimes you need to leave that little gap there to make sure sort of things work. So I'm not going to get too fussy. Your eye can figure out what is growing where, I hope. And if I leave a little piece of land here and then put some snow on it, you work it out from there. The only thing I need to do is make sure that these look a little taller on the right hand side. And my colour's a little bit lime, but that's okay. I'm just looking to get the basic sort of shapes in here. It's quite a complicated part of the painting here because you can see the bridge, you can see a rail, but when you look at the reference photograph you see there's one of these rails on the far side of the bridge, and it all gets a little bit sort of fiddly. My suggestion here is not to fall into the trap of trying to paint everything you see in the reference picture. So sometimes you have to sort of see a dark tree, then see the dark tree on the other side and ignore the fact that there is supposed to be a railing there. It's okay sometimes to leave out bits of a painting. Even if you know you want to put them in, don't fall into the trap of kind of trying to paint everything you see. As I often tell people, my backdrops are like having the chorus line. But you just want to have a few little movie stars in the foreground. That's where your eye is supposed to be working. See, I'm just rolling my brush across here and I'm just putting a few sort of abstract shapes in, nothing special. There. Let's work on this tree next. This little tree is actually a huge mass of branches, thousands of them. They look like one big dark tree. In actual fact, when you look carefully at your reference photograph, you can see a lot of the sky through there. Now, to try and paint something like that, you have to spend a lot of time trying to paint individual twigs and branches. You could be there a very long time doing it. So we have to represent what we're seeing by using sort of more suggestion rather than actual detail. Incidentally, I want to use that brush again, and to wash it, I simply touch it into a little touch of the oil. Let's just say this is linseed oil, just touch it to that. Get a bit of linseed oil going through it. A little piece of paper towel. Give it a pinch and a squeeze. And that's what I call a dry clean of my brush. Give it a little twiddle. Most of the colours out. If I need to repeat that step a couple of times, that will definitely be clean enough for my painting. There we go. Now, if I were putting on white snow, then I wouldn't use that brush. But for a nice little tree in the background there, I think I'm okay. I'm going to pick up some more of my Payne's grey colour here. I think I need to put some more of that out. And I just want to rough in where I think this tree is going to be. And as I say, all I'm doing here is I'm going to suggest the shape of it, just rough it in, and then I'll add a bunch of twigs on top. But right now you're seeing the suggestion of a bush or a tree, and that's it. You only have to really hint at it, and then add a few nice sort of stems and stalks and branches and things, and suddenly your eye will see a tree or a bush in winter. It's lost all its leaves. Well, that's the theory anyway. Let's see how well I can do with it. You see, it's all right talking the talk, but can you walk the walk? Okay. Let's put a bit more Payne's grey on my palette. So as you saw from that little bit of time lapse, sometimes you only have to really suggest that something is there to make it look real. Just the hint that there is some foliage there, maybe some branches, and you can still see some background sky through it, tells you that this is possibly a tree that's lost its leaves for the season. But I do want to add a few little details on there, and for that I'll be using a liner brush. Now, two sorts of liner brush here. This one, natural bristle, this one, synthetic. I quite like using both of them. I think I'll probably have a go at the synthetic one today. I usually use the bristle one, and these vary sometimes. You can get some of these which just don't seem to want to play ball. They split apart very easily, and sometimes it happens when you get a little tiny drop of paint drying down here in the bezel. Again, a little drop of oil just to sort of stick everything together, and I think a little touch of Payne's grey. See what I mean by being a blue-grey colour. And I like using Payne's grey for these sorts of background details because they're quite sort of a soft colour, whereas black is very dense and kind of almost too strong, whereas these sorts of colours, you can put them into the background of a painting and they sort of fit really nicely. I'll spend a few minutes doing this and then we'll come back and see what it looks like. So here's my painting progressed to the stage where I'm looking at doing some work in the foreground. Now, if we have a quick look at the reference here, you'll see that really what we're dealing with is some snow with some nice blue-grey shadows and some nice orangey sort of brown grasses. And that blue colour and the orange colour, well, they're complementary colours. They really work well together. It's one of the reasons why I chose this picture, because it's lots of lovely blues and oranges. The choice of photograph is sometimes more sort of about the colours than it is about the subject matter. So pick your photographs carefully and decide on ones that really grab your attention. They're the ones that usually jump out from a whole stream of photographs you might see on a page. Anyway, let's start putting on some of the foreground snow. And by the way, snow is white, which is opaque. So a lot of the work I've done in here is going to get covered up. But that's okay. This grey colour is my mid-tone. Now, highlights. For this background snow, as you see, I've washed my brush. I'm going to use some titanium white paint here. And I'm going to use shades of titanium white, little touches of Prussian blue. So I'll put some blue over there, just a little bit. I can add some Payne's grey into this as well. But so I want some nice sort of blue-grey colours for snow, and I'll save my brightest snow for another part of my painting. So I'm going to just put in the suggestion of a little bit of snow back in here. Remember, of course, the canvas is still oily, so if you touch any of that green colour, you're going to pick it up, but, well, we'll live dangerously. There we go. And maybe that's a bit too bright. I want to just dull that slightly. A little touch of the grey colour. Remember, things that are in the distance want to be less bright, they want to be much more subdued, toned down in fact. I'm not sure if I have just toned it down at all, or if I've done anything to that, but never mind. Let's just put a little bit of snow in here, just to suggest that there's a little snow field back there. Once again, this is far away in the distance of my painting, so I'm not going to get overly sort of concerned about it. If the detail isn't exactly perfect, I'm not going to fret and worry too much about it at all. There we go. Add a little bit of snow to this bank here now. Up against the side of the bridge, it's fairly bright, but it quickly goes into a shadow. So again, I'm going to hold my brush like a stick and just let the brush bounce. And maybe hold it too tight, you lose that kind of nice effect. You almost want this to be kind of more random. There we go, nice little bits of snow stuck to the side of the bridge. And this is all in grey, or blue-grey, so pick up a bit more blue. There we go. Don't forget, leave a few little holes in there as well. We'll drop in a little bit of vegetation. Just for a second I thought I was blathering away and forgot to switch my microphone on again. There we go. There we go. It's surprising that as you paint snow that's in shadow, you want colours which are quite blue-grey and muted. And you think when you look at it, you think it doesn't look anything like snow. But it's surprising actually. You start adding a few little bits of vegetation and a few lumps and bumps, and suddenly it all comes together. Now let's not fiddle too much with that bit, but let's start putting a bit of blue greys over on this side. So I'm going to try and drop the snow in first, and then I'm going to sort of try and weave the orange colour in between. So that's the approach I'm going for. Yeah. Again, it's an experiment, so I don't know if this is going to work. It might be a terrible disaster, but that's part of it. Part of the joy of painting, isn't it? And again, I'm thinking about how I'm going to capture this as opposed to sticking to the photograph which I'm working from, because actually there's lots of orange over there, but it's going to be very difficult to plant orange and get the white next to it. So sometimes I might just do things a little bit differently to the reference photograph just to make it doable. Again, don't get too tied in knots by the reference photograph. You mustn't let that become too much of a straitjacket for you. When you're painting, look at what you're trying to paint. Think about how you could logically make something work, how to make it look believable and possible, because sometimes we look at things we're trying to paint and it's almost impossible to get it exactly like the photograph. We end up sort of breaking out into a sweat trying to get something to look perfectly like the photograph, and it just doesn't. Now this doesn't look much like the photograph. If I bring the reference up here in the corner, you can see that what I'm doing here looks like a complete pickle. But I'm going to have to stick with it for the time being until I get some of the other elements in place. It's no good jumping to conclusions too soon. Let's drop in a little bit of snow here. Again, just drag it on. And as I mentioned in that little intro, once you start working with things like white, these are opaque colours, they don't have a transparency to them, and yet if you're careful like this, you can make them go on very thinly and still see a little grey coming through, so you can fool them into working a little better for you sometimes. Now then, just going to scrub this on. Very nice and thin. And I can see if I can get some little bits of orange vegetation on here. There we go. When it comes to mixing warm oranges My choice is always red and Indian yellow. It produces the most lovely intense orangey tones, and you can use a little more of the Indian yellow to tone that down. And if it's too intense, you want a slightly more straw colour, just add a little touch of white. Now you could go yellow ochre for sure, that's another possibility. But you can get a really nice colour using white, Indian yellow and red. You can see I've progressed my colour down. I'm just sort of dragging it further and further from that red colour. And I'm getting some nice sort of warm orangey red colours here. Now then, there's a lovely couple of nice little bushes up in here. And there's lots of sort of nice orangey colours growing along the top here. So I'm going to just kind of close the end of this rail off. Again, I'm just literally going to just stipple this on here. I'm not trying to plant or paint individual trees and bushes. I'm just looking for an impression here. So here's where you have to try and make a bit of a call. How far into the painting do you go with a colour that's not quite what you want it to be, or not quite the colour you want it to be, that you can mix easily? And the reason why I make a point of this is because sometimes we start off with a colour and we get a ton of work done on our painting, only to stand back and think, I wish I'd changed it sooner rather than later. And I feel that could be the case here, that this colour is just a little too orangey and I want it a little bit more sort of straw coloured. Let's put out a little bit of yellow ochre and give it a try. Okay, so I put out some yellow ochre and a touch of white. So I've got a much nicer sort of straw colour. See, it's a slightly different colour. This is a little bit fiery and orange. This is a little bit more sort of what I sort of think about, more of a sort of dead grass sort of look. Let's put a little bit of that on there. See, it's just a subtle difference, isn't it? Yeah, I think I quite like that. To go with this sort of ochre colour, I'm probably going to mix up some more of this brownish tone here as well, which was sap green and red. Sap green and red make like a dark sienna colour, which I think would work well with my ochre colour there. So again, it just needs a little bit of a dark shadow colour to it. Once again, I'm just experimenting here. I'm just adding little touches of colour, little shadow colours. And there's a little bit of this growing amongst, it's on the ground between the snow. So I'm going to just try and sneaky this in here. And if I pick up a little bit of snow, it's actually okay. I think there's a little bit of this actually looks like a bank, and there's actually quite a dark patch of this sort of vegetation growing in here. So I'm going to just, so it looks like it's going from shadow into highlight, so I'm going to just twiddle that on. There we go. Looks like one becomes the other as it goes from shadow into daylight. And if you want to make that transition look sharper, so it goes from shadow into highlight. See where that little piece of snow is there that's bright? Match it with highlight on that grass. So you want to make sure that as the snow gets bright, so does that little piece of land. Now look at that, how that colour goes from one straight into the other. Quite a definite change of colour. And that's how you make it look more believable from going from one colour into the other. You've got to be quite sharp with it. There's some more of this kind of darker vegetation growing down the bottom of the bank. Let's add a twiggly bit of that in there too. Again, this is the bit that's sort of in the shadow. That needs to be a little bit browner. And then I'm good to go again. There we go. I think that's done. Okay, my video moved on a little bit there. I hit the record button on my computer screen, and for some unknown reason this program just refuses sometimes just to start recording. Most frustrating. But all I did, just to recap, is I went into some of this lovely orangey brown colour I mixed up. And a bit like when I did this tree in the background here, what I did is I just started scrubbing on colour. Very random. I'll just show you exactly what I did. And all I'm doing is I'm aiming for the little bits of grey between some of the snow where there's just oil and no white paint. And I'm not painting anything in particular. I'm just literally letting the brush scrub colour onto the painting. Now, what I'm doing is something really kind of more suggestive. I'm suggesting that there could be maybe something that's under the snow, maybe some nice grasses that have died back, and maybe there was water washed up this bank and it's just sort of washed everything into dead grass. And the idea here is that more by suggestion, more abstract, that sometimes you don't actually have to paint very much. In the same way as just scrubbing on a little bit of colour over there, you believe it. It looks like snow in a riverbank and a highlight. And on this side, literally all I did was take my brush, and in the bits where there was no snow, I scrub on a little bit of that brown colour, and I just let it kind of bump in to the background. Now, if I take my brush and just do a little flick or two, suddenly you see grass. I actually painted none of it, really. I didn't do anything in particular in terms of anything kind of difficult. I literally just scrubbed the colour in and let it fool you into believing what you want it to be. Now, sometimes when we're doing abstract things, we kind of want to control it too much. We kind of want to just sort of, we want it to look more real than it needs to be. I can't really describe it in any other way, but it's just one of those things when we're learning to paint, we just feel that we need to control every element of a painting instead of just kind of chilling out and relaxing and just letting the paint do the work for us. It's just one of those things that we just think, well, I have to be in control. I have to make the paint do things a certain way for me to be in control. And it is difficult not to do that. You see, just as I'm doing that, I'm literally just pushing the paint out with the end of my brush, and now you start to see grass hanging over the edge of the water. And I can't explain it any other way than to sometimes you just have to relax a little bit, and not to try and overpower your paintings, not to try and muscle it and kind of force it to do certain things. Let the paint flow, let the brush make some abstract marks, and don't fight with your work. And you will be surprised at just how good you paint. The less you think about it, the more you just let the brush do the work for you. I'm going to add a little bit more detail into here and bring bring my painting to a finish. So those finer little touches of snow like I've done in here. I don't use pure titanium white. I use white with a touch of ochre, and it is surprisingly bright, even if it looks a little bit sort of yellowish. As you see, when it touches my painting, suddenly that little tiny touch of yellow ochre makes it jump off the canvas. It's an amazing transformation that pure white colour can look brighter with a touch of yellow ochre into it. You see it just really glows. Now, don't want to overdo this, because it's possible just to put on too much of this. But you see just the indication there's a little bit of a bump there in the ground. It catches a little bit more of that brightness from the snow. I probably should have done this before I started putting all the grass on, but I got a bit carried away there, didn't I? Never mind. What I was saying about keeping everything looking sort of kind of more sort of random and less organised in our paintings. Well, the process of fiddling tends to reorganise our paintings for us, and we tend to end up kind of overworking it all. So there we go. I don't think I'm going to put any more on my painting. Maybe just a little touch of that, just to balance things up on the other side, a little bit of that seascape white colour. There we go. I think that's it for my painting today. I forgot to do something with that little hole back in there, but maybe I'll just spotted that at the last second. Maybe I'll just put a little bit of snow back in there. Oh, nice little snowbank in the distance there. I think that's it for my painting. Just got to add a signature. So there you have it, a finished painting, the lovely stone bridge, starting with a simple line drawing and some glazes. I think this has worked out really well, and it's a technique I hope you try really soon. Now, if you've enjoyed watching my video, don't forget, give a like and subscribe to the channel even. Leave a comment down below. You can even go so far as leaving a few dollars or a few pounds in my coffee pot. There's also a membership section, and just for a few pounds or dollars a month, you can support the making of future videos. Now, don't move, because there's some more lovely videos for you to watch coming right along. Happy painting, people.